Hello. I apologize for Monday. There was a lot going on. Our son is down in Ecuador in Guayaquil, and he's one of a total of 118 missionaries between the three Guayaquil missions, 28 in Jacob's mission in Guayaquil West, that hadn't been able to get any humanitarian flights out of Ecuador to come home. And so we were working through all kinds of things with him and the mission office on Monday. And to make a long story short, we were told by them, along with 117 other families, to purchase a ticket on an emergency flight from Eastern Airlines from Guayaquil to Miami on Wednesday, April 1st, which is when most of you are going to be watching this video. So if all goes well, we're praying, keeping our fingers crossed that that flight shows up, because they've been notorious for not showing up on past flights like this. But they're telling us at the U.S. Embassy that this is the last flight out. So we're praying. But at the end of the day, we trust. We know that God is in charge, and whatever's best is going to happen, and we'll be okay with that. But if all goes well, he'll fly to Miami on Wednesday afternoon, and then stay overnight, and then fly to Salt Lake on Thursday. So that's what's been going on, and why I've been a little bit distracted. Now today, we're going to be talking in our lesson about, I just have to be honest with you, this is the hardest lesson to teach. It's the most painful, because we're talking about the trials, the abuse that Jesus is going to take, and he's going to be in front of the Sanhedrin, the chief priests. Then he's going to be in front of Pilate, Herod, and Pilate. And he's going to be scourged. He's going to be led to Calvary, and then he's going to be crucified. And that's what we're talking about today. In other words, we need help. We need the guidance of the Holy Ghost to teach us what we need to learn in order to have this be a meaningful experience. So I would encourage you to pause the video, and if you want, listen to a song or two that's connected with the crucifixion. Maybe sing a hymn or listen to one, and then offer a sincere word of prayer as we begin. All right. For starters, I'm going to take us over here to the iPad to begin. I want you to think about this question. If you were asked, where did Jesus experience the most excruciating pain? Where did he pay the biggest price for your soul? The options are A, in Gethsemane, B, during those trials that we were talking about, trials in front of both the Jewish Sanhedrin as well as the three Roman trials, Herod in the middle, but 2 times in front of Pilate. So Pilate, Herod, Pilate. Or C, on Calvary, on the cross. Where did he experience the worst excruciating pain and pay the biggest price? My guess is, my hunch is that many in the past have been tempted to say the answer is A. That's the lesson that we covered last time, with this whole millstone analogy and all of the pain and the anguish and temptations and suffered through death and hell and all of those things that were associated with that. Elder James E. Talmage, when he wrote the book Jesus the Christ, he said that when Jesus was on the cross, from 12 o'clock to about 3 p.m., all of the weight from Gethsemane returned to Jesus, intensified while on the cross. Now, you might think that that's strange to hear that word. It's intensified. I just want you to think through this for a minute. Which position do you prefer to be in when you're suffering the most intense pain? Do you prefer to be horizontal, laying down, or vertical? My guess is most of us are going to vote for the horizontal. It's just easier. Do you prefer to be stretched out or curled up? My guess is most of you are going to wish for it to be curled up. It's just the body inherently endures pain easier that way. Do you enjoy is the wrong word. Do you prefer suffering intensely in a big crowd with everybody watching, or with some privacy alone? Do you prefer it to be out in noonday, or do you prefer it to be in the dark of night? Does it just somehow create a little easier way to cope with the pain you're enduring? We could keep going with these contrasts, but if you look at Gethsemane and compare it with Calvary, everything that happens in Gethsemane, he's on the ground, he's probably curled up, it's dark, nobody's there except for Peter, James, and John, and they fell asleep all 3 times. Everything seems to be the ideal, if you can call it an ideal, position or situation in order to endure intense, in this case, infinite amounts of pain. But the next day on Calvary, the next morning, when he's lifted up, he's stretched out, he's in front of everybody in public humiliation. It's the worst possible position in which to endure pain, because in this situation, he's even struggling to just breathe normally, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So as we begin today's lesson, we're going to be talking about B and C. But I want to be careful, because sometimes we put everything in this and this basket as well, Gethsemane and Calvary, when in reality there are places where we're told that he's also experiencing redemptive suffering for us, even during the trials. As an example, Isaiah, let me write the reference here. Isaiah chapter 52, verse 14 says that he gave his back to the smiters and his cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. Let me just show you here. So, sorry, I gave you the wrong reference. I'll give you that one in a minute. So 52:14 is right here. As many were astonished, astonished is just an old English way of saying astonished. They're shocked, they're abhorred by this. As many were astonished at thee, his visage, his countenance, his appearance was so marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. So Isaiah is saying that he's going to be marred, and his appearance is going to be beat up more than any man. That's interesting. If you go back now to chapter 50, this is the one that I was quoting you before, verse 6. I gave my back to the smiters, and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John don't even go there. And I hid not my face from shame and spitting. So in front of the Sanhedrin, he's going to be blindfolded, and they're going to smite him and say, if thou art the Christ, prophesy who smote thee. And they're going to spit on him and say, who spit on you? And he's not going to answer them anything. In another Isaiah passage, he says that by his stripes we are healed. That sounds redemptive. That sounds atoning. It sounds like there's something taking place in the trials where Jesus is being punished in some way, and we're being healed because of it. I don't understand how the infinite atonement of Jesus Christ heals us, how he's able to experience vicariously all the things that we experience. I don't understand that any more than I understand how, when I ate my cereal this morning, all of the processes that take place in my body to translate that food, that bowl of cereal with milk on it, into thoughts and feelings and heat and muscle capacity and sight and sound and the ability to live and think. And I don't know how that works, but I know it works. And I've experienced it over and over again. It's the exact same thing with the infinite atonement of Jesus Christ. I don't know all the mechanics. I don't know why he had to suffer the way he did in the 3 different realms that he did, but I know that because of his suffering, you and I are benefited in some way from that. And it's beautiful to contemplate. Now, go with me to another scripture here. Turn over to 2 Nephi chapter 9. Okay, so 2 Nephi chapter 9 is where Jacob is presenting this beautiful Isaiah set of chapters in chapter 7 and 8. And now in 9, he gives his commentary. Look what he says here to the people in verse 5. Check this out. Yea, I know that ye know that in the body he shall show himself unto those at Jerusalem from whence we came, for it is expedient that it should be among them. For it behooveth the great Creator that he suffereth himself to become subject unto man in the flesh, and die for all men, that all men might become subject unto him. Look carefully at this. It's using words like expedient, behooveth. These are requirement words. He had to do this in order to fulfill this infinite atonement. He had to suffer himself to become, notice, subject unto man in the flesh. Most of you are comfortable with Jesus going into Gethsemane and saying, Father, not my will, but thine be done. You're comfortable with him becoming subject unto God. Often we overlook the fact that he also had to become subject unto man in the flesh. In other words, he had to say to these wicked men, not my will, but thine be done. You can do whatever you want to me. Hence, the blindfolding, the spitting, the slapping, the giving his back to the smiters and his cheeks to them that plucked off the hair, and allowing himself, his countenance, his visage, to be marred more than any man. In Hebrew, if you want to do some research on this one, go to Isaiah 52:14 in Strong's Concordance and look up the word for marred. And you'll notice how close it is to the Hebrew word Mashiach, Messiah. His countenance is so anointed that he becomes so marred. You just have to change a few of the vowel markings and a little tittle, and you've got his countenance is so marred. But if you put in different vowel markings, it becomes his countenance is so anointed, Messiahed, more than any man. So isn't that amazing that because he was so anointed, so highly favored of God, he becomes so highly rejected and despised and abused by man in the flesh. And this is all in the middle of this Garden of Gethsemane and Golgotha experience that he's going through these trials in the middle. Now, as far as our scriptures are concerned, jump now with me to, let me pull up my other scripture here, the library. Let's go into the book of John. I'll meet you in John chapter 18. Okay, so this is coming out of Gethsemane. We've experienced everything that we did there at the end of that lesson in Gethsemane that we talked about last time. And we're going to Caiaphas's palace. Okay, so here we get Simon, Peter, following Jesus, standing back, obviously, and he's outside the door. So another apostle, that other disciple, was known to the high priest. He went and he brought in Peter. Now begins the interesting scenario. The damsel at the door said, "Hey, aren't you one of that man's disciples?" And notice Peter's response, "I am not." Strike one. Then the servant of the officer stood there. They made a fire of coals, for it was cold. I don't know if you've ever noticed that before. We often skip over some of these details, but the reality is the night that Jesus was in Gethsemane, it was cold. He was bleeding from every pore on the ground for 3 hours, 3 to 4 hours. It's a cold night. There's so many things in the infinite atonement that you and I can't wrap our mind and our capacity to think in those terms. We can't get our head around that. But there are some of these elements that we can relate to. You know what it's like to be out and to be wet or sweating, but be in a really cold place. Anyway, Jesus overcame all things for us, even these things that we can understand, not just the ones that are infinite and eternal. So they're sitting there, and Peter's warming himself by the fire. And then the high priest asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. So inside, Peter can kind of see Jesus being tried. And he asks more questions. And then in verse 25, as Simon was warming himself, they said, "Hey, aren't you one of his disciples?" And he denied it and said, "I am not." There's number 2. You can mark it. Second time. And then, shortly thereafter, another servant who was a kinsman to the guy Malchus that Peter cut his ear off said, "Hey, didn't I see you in the garden with him?" And Peter denied again. And immediately the cock crew. There have been a lot of people who have written and spoken about this. President Spencer W. Kimball gave a great talk at BYU called "Peter, My Brother," about this whole experience, because there were a lot of people who were beating up Peter and throwing him under the bus and talking about how weak he was, that he couldn't even stand up for Jesus, and he's denying him 3 times. And the talk from President Kimball was basically, back off, leave Peter alone. He was very, very important in the premortal realm. He was Jesus's chief disciple and chief apostle in mortality, and he is going to lead out with the church after Jesus's resurrection. And if there's any wrongdoing here, Jesus forgives him. And I love that perspective. So we're not making fun of Peter, and we're not telling him he did something bad or dumb or wicked in any way, shape, or form here. I think the principle that we can learn from this is Peter was told by Jesus just not that many hours before this, that before the cock crows, you're going to deny me 3 times, Peter. And here it happened. In Matthew's account, it says that after the cock crowed, Peter went out and wept bitterly. I wonder if there might be some application to little old Tyler Griffin, or you can fill in the blank with your own name. I wonder if there are times when we say, "Oh, no, others might give in, others might deny you, but not me. I'm going to be fine." And again, I'm not talking about Peter here. I'm applying or likening his story to my situation. Of all the places Peter could have gone, Caiaphas' palace is probably the worst if you're trying to not deny Jesus, because that's where you're going to be tempted to deny him. Even though moments before in Gethsemane, you're pulling out your sword, you're ready to attack the whole group, and nobody defends your buddy, or Malchus, their buddy. The only one who comes to his defense that night was Jesus, the guy that Malchus had come to arrest. So if you consider this for a moment, Peter goes to Caiaphas' palace, gets strike 1, then strike 2, and instead of leaving, he sticks around and then gets strike 3. Then Matthew says he went out and wept bitterly. I think it might be significant for us, and I don't know how much this applies to Peter's situation, because I know how he is so fiercely loyal to Jesus and willing to lay down his life for Jesus. But I do know this, that the animal that Jesus chose for this object lesson was a rooster, a cock, because there have been far too many times, quite frankly, where I've become cocky in a situation where I've thought, I got this, I can do this, and then I fall. And I think, oh, strike 1. Okay, well, I got this now, and then I fall. Strike 2. And I think, oh, next time's going to be different. But it's not. Strike 3. Because the flesh is weak. The spirit might be really willing, but the flesh is weak in certain settings. And unfortunately, we sometimes put ourselves in a Caiaphas palace setting where we're setting ourselves up for greater temptation. And even though we might be cocky going into it, thinking, I got this, turns out that we realize we're chicken in the heat of the moment. A rooster is an ancient alarm clock. It's your wake-up call. And I think for the rest of Peter's life, every time he gets to hear a rooster crowing, it's a reminder of a similar wake-up call when Jesus had told him, Peter, when thou art converted, strengthen thy brethren. This experience to me has to be one of those deeply poignant experiences in Peter's conversion process that's going to culminate in Acts chapter 2. And from that moment forward, you're going to see Peter just doing amazing things. Not that he hasn't been amazing before, but it's going to be remarkable. So as you move forward in life, the application here might be try to recognize what Caiaphas's palace might be for you. What are the settings? What are the situations? Who are the people? Who are the relationships that just put you in situations where you just fall? It's hard, and figure out how to maybe stay away from Caiaphas' palace. Now, after he's condemned by the Sanhedrin, he's taken in front of Pilate to be judged. Sanhedrin's already condemned him, so now they're taking him to Pilate. And notice Pilate's sitting there going, I don't see what's wrong with this guy. I can't see anything that he did other than this internal struggle with your religion. So to pick up this story, let's go over to Matthew, and we're going to pick it up in chapter 27. So Pilate does something very interesting here. It's at this time of year when the governor was wont to release unto the people, means accustomed to releasing unto the people a prisoner. You can see that in the Greek footnote if you follow it. And so he says, okay, I don't see anything wrong with Jesus, so I'm going to get a notable prisoner, one that the people are less likely to say, yeah, freely forgive him for our Passover tradition, and they're going to want him to stay in prison. So they'll release Jesus, right? That seems to be maybe what's going on in Pilate's mind here. So he brings up this guy named Barabbas. Oh, I don't like Barabbas. He was in prison. If you combine the gospel accounts, he's in prison because he's a murderer, a thief, and an insurrectionist. He's a bad guy, and he's in prison. And so here you get this guy by the name of Barabbas. Bar means son of. Abbas means his father. So here you get the son of his father, and standing next to Jesus, who is the Bar Abba, the real son of the Father in heaven. And you get this contrast. And what did the people do? They all shout, who do you want to have released? And they said, Barabbas. Give us Barabbas. And then Pilate's like, well, then what do you want me to do with Jesus? And they'll say, let him be crucified. Can you see why I don't like this guy? Barabbas is bad. He's done horrible things, and he gets released while Jesus, who hasn't done anything wrong, gets taken and is going to be crucified. I don't like that. Unless you think it through and say, wait a minute. Barabbas, his story sounds really hauntingly familiar. A person who is guilty, who deserves to be punished, but because he gets released, Jesus gets taken in his place and pays a price, in essence, for him in a roundabout sort of a way. The more one thinks about it, the more one might be able to say, I wonder if Barabbas' story is actually my story. I wonder if I'm Barabbas in a symbolic way. that might be worth thinking about. Now, moving on. Notice that Pilate realizes he's not going to persuade these leaders of the Jews. So he washed his hands before the multitude, as if to say, I'm innocent of Jesus's blood. I'm not responsible for his death. And the people said, no, his blood be on us and on our children. And keep in mind, this is not all of the Jews. This is just the Sanhedrin, the chief priests, the leaders of the people who hold the power of ruling in their hands, and they don't want to lose it. So Jesus says, okay. So they took him to the common hall, gathered around him the whole band of soldiers. Okay, they stripped him and put a scarlet robe upon him. By the way, I skipped verse 26. I shouldn't do that. They scourged him first. Let me show you this. If you look at scourging, let me go here. This is what you see here is our earliest depiction of crucifixion. It dates to the 2nd century. Here is the original. It's graffiti on a wall in Rome, dating to the 2nd century. And what it says here is Alexamenos. So this guy is a disciple of Christ. Alexamenos is worshiping Theon, his god. You'll notice how these Greco-Romans have portrayed Alexamenos' god on a cross as a donkey. They're mocking Christians. They're making fun of them. Ironically, this is our earliest depiction of crucifixion. Our second earliest depiction shows this. It's also kind of a graffiti, and you'll notice the stripes on the back, and they go from neck down to knee on the back. I don't want to make anybody sick here, and I don't want to over dramatize this, but you guys, this was not gentle. Many of our depictions show the scourging event as this horsewhip. If that were the case, you'd get whelps and these welt marks on the back. That isn't what they're doing. They're using a stinging whip. It's a scorpion whip is basically how the Greek word could get translated. So it's long strips of leather with metal and bone and glass and rocks that are sharp, and they drag them across the victim's back all the way up and down, leaving them striped. This was not gentle in any way, what Jesus endured in this phase. He gave his back to the smiters and his cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. Might be the way that we would describe that. Now let's pop back over into the scripture. The part that we want to focus on here is the fact that when they finish scourging him, they then stripped him and put on him a scarlet robe. You'll notice that Joseph Smith changed the word scarlet to be purple. That might seem like an insignificant change to you, but the fact is if you go clear back to the book of Numbers, so if you go back into the Old Testament, the tabernacle has all of these elements in it, like the Holy of Holies has the Ark of the Covenant. You have the table of showbread, the altar of incense, and the menorah, and the altar, and the laver, and all these elements that need to be moved. When you move them, the book of Numbers tells you exactly the order to cover them in and how to cover them. And they're mostly cloths of blue that get placed over most of the elements. And then there's a couple things with red, and there's one thing that gets covered in purple. Most would think it's the Holy of Holies element, which is the Ark of the Covenant, but it's not. It's the altar of sacrifice. It doesn't get covered in red, it gets covered in purple. Where the lambs are slain, that thing gets covered in purple cloth before it's then moved into the wilderness to the next location where they're going to camp. I find that beautiful that now they strip Jesus and put on him not just a red robe, but a purple robe. I wonder if that's symbolic to what went on in the Old Testament with this altar of sacrifice, to show that this heavenly lamb is going to shed its blood. Blue, red mixed together makes purple. And I know they didn't mix blue and red back then to do that. They had crustaceans that they would have to process in order to get purple. That's why it's the sign of royalty. Only kings would wear purple. Jesus is the King of Kings, but he's also a blue, red, heaven, blood combined makes purple today. So as we liken that today, you have the king dressed in a purple robe that is now ready for the sacrifice on the altar. So they put the crown of thorns on his head in verse 29, and the reed in his right hand, and they bow the knee and they mock him. Oh, hail, King of the Jews. They've dressed him up like a king with this crown of thorns. And then they also spit upon him and take the reed out of his hand, and they smite him on the head. I feel very insignificant even talking about these events, I have to be honest with you, because there's a profound price being paid for my soul and for your soul throughout all of this, and we're talking through it as if it's a story that we talk about every day. Just know that we're treading on very sacred ground here. After they mocked him, they took off the robe, put his own raiment on him. And by the way, if they've scourged him, his whole back all the way down is going to be an open wound. They put that robe on him, then take it back off, put his own clothes on him, and they're going to take that back off once they get up to Golgotha. Along the way, they find a man named Simon of Cyrene who has to carry his cross the rest of the way. And when they come to this place, Golgotha, which means a place of the skull, they lay him down on that back that would be an open wound, and they crucified him and parted his garments, casting lots. When they're crucifying him, you need to understand that the Romans have perfected this art of crucifixion. And I don't want to gross anybody out here, but we need to explain a couple things regarding crucifixion. Romans crucified tens of thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands of people. It was their preferred mode of execution for non-Roman citizens. So if you're a Roman citizen, you can't be crucified. It's too cruel. It's too painful. They would behead you or kill you in a different manner. Because what crucifixion does is it stretches out. If there's a threshold over which your pain level gets when you die or when you pass out, the Romans figured out how to get people really close to that threshold and then have them just suffer as long as possible in public shame. It was a terrible ordeal that they did to tens of thousands of people. In 69 and 70, so a couple of decades after Jesus' crucifixion, when you get 3 Roman legions coming to siege and wipe out Jerusalem, you're going to get them lining the streets with crosses, and they're going to be crucifying people in all kinds of different configurations, tying some, nailing others. It's awful. It's brutal. It's a sign of man's inhumanity to man. With Jesus, what we know from Revelation is that there were nails put in his palm, but we know from history that the Romans didn't traditionally put nails in the palm because it won't hold the weight. But where the radius and the ulna come together at the wrist, they could pierce it there, and that would hold the weight of the body. When they pierce that median nerve, if you look at your hand for a minute and consider all of the nerve endings, the touch, the sensors, the heat, the cold, the perception of location and orientation of your fingers, even if you're not looking at them, you can kind of tell. All of that information comes down through nerves. When they pierce one of those nerves, the median nerve, it causes everything in this quarter of your body to kind of tense up, and you lose control and it goes into spasms. What that does is that's going to make it so that after about, I don't know, depending on the person, after about 20 to 30 to 40 minutes, you've lost control over these muscles. They've spasmed and they're spent. Your brain can tell it to do something and it won't do it. Now stop and think about something for a minute. Think about air. How grateful are you to have so much oxygen surrounding you? Most of you probably haven't thought much about oxygen today until I just mentioned that. But you can imagine what it would be like if you didn't have air. Now, how much would you think about oxygen? I think that example applies on two levels. One, how often do you think about the infinite atonement of Jesus Christ? It is so ubiquitous. It's all around us. Its effects are blessing us every single day to the point where we don't even recognize it. We don't think about it in some cases. The other way to consider that little analogy of oxygen is that's the big struggle for crucifixion victims. They're placed on crosses. And if they're nailed, then after 30, 40 minutes, you can no longer use your chest muscles to breathe. So if you pause and think for a minute, how are you breathing? Just pay attention. Many of you are using your chest to extend and contract to get air in and out of your lungs. If you've lost those muscles, their ability to expand and contract, then you only have one option, and it's your diaphragm to be able to come out and in. If you're hanging from a cross, your diaphragm is compressed. In order to breathe, you have to pull up on those nails or push up from your feet to express or to extend that stomach out so your diaphragm can then breathe. That's why when the leaders of the Jews go to Pilate later on and say, hey, it's almost sunset. It's going to be the Sabbath day, the high Sabbath, if you're reading John's account, which is a Sabbath day that also happens to be Passover. We can't have people dying on a cross during the Sabbath. So you got to kill them right away and get them off the cross. So what did the soldiers do? They went out to the two malefactors on either side of Jesus and they broke their legs. Because by now they can't pull up on the muscles here aren't going to do the pulling up, the weightlifting, and they can no longer lift up with their legs. And so they're going to die very, very quickly. They're going to drown in midair. They can't get the air in and out. They're surrounded by oxygen, but they can't get it in and out. So that's one of the struggles we're facing when you put this whole scenario of Jesus suffering the infinite atonement and Elder Talmage's words of the full weight of Gethsemane returning to Jesus from noon to 3 p.m. intensified. I would say intensified, because now you not only get all that weight and all that price being paid, but he's even just struggling to breathe, let alone pay the price for all these things. Now, on the cross, Jesus is going to make quite a few statements. We only have a small handful of recorded statements that Jesus made while hanging on the cross. According to Mark's time frame, Jesus is placed on the cross in the morning, the third hour, which is about 9 a.m. So from 9 a.m. to noon, you're going to get quite a few statements, and then he's going to suffer, according to most prophetic accounts. He suffers from noon to 3 p.m., 3 more hours, the awful agonies of Gethsemane return, and Elder Talmage's word, intensified. So let's look for some of the statements that Jesus makes while he's up on the cross. You might want to write these down. These aren't in any particular order because we don't know the order. You'll notice Luke, John, Matthew, Luke is the last one here. But we don't know the exact words he used. We just know the way that different gospel writers recorded some of the statements. And so I just put them here in a potential order that you might consider them in. Let's take these one at a time. You can actually pause the video here so you can go look these up and look at each individual statement that Jesus made, and you could make a list of those in your scriptures so that you know the 7 statements. Now, hopefully you were able to pause that and go and look those up, because I'm not going to talk about all of them in detail. We're just going to cover a couple of highlights from some of them. But you do need to know all of these. They're all important. The first one, Luke 23:34. Do any of you find it interesting that right after being abused with his visage marred more so than any man by these Roman soldiers, the first thing that we have record of Jesus saying on the cross is, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. I wouldn't have said that to that group. I would have said, Father, punish them. Or I'm going to be meeting you someday and it's not going to be good for you. But not Jesus. Because you see, Jesus practices what he preaches, and he told us that if we're to be his disciples, we should not just love our neighbors and hate our enemies. We should love our neighbors and love our enemies and do good to people who despitefully use us. And that's exactly what he's doing there. In Luke 23:43, you'll notice he tells the malefactor on one side of him, this day shalt thou be with me in paradise. Instead of turning inward when he's suffering in pain like I do, Jesus turns outward. First to the soldiers, now to the guy on his side who's guilty. He tells us he's guilty, and Jesus says, today you'll be with me in paradise. And then in John 19, you'll notice that he addresses his mother, who happens to be there. This is kind of a difficult, tender moment, because it's difficult for a mom to see her child suffering in any way, shape, or form. But in this case, it must have just torn Mary's heart apart to see him on the cross. And Jesus, seeing her standing afar off next to John, his beloved apostle, he says, woman, behold thy son, and John, behold thy mother. In other words, he put his mom's care into John's hands. Take care of my mom as if she were your own. I think that's significant, because John is the only person who is guaranteed to outlive Mary and to be the perfect bodyguard for Jesus' mother. I love that. Then in Matthew 27, it's now the end of this ordeal, towards the end of this ordeal, when Jesus raises up and shouts, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Elder Jeffrey R. Holland gave an incredible talk on the Infinite Atonement called And None Were With Him. If you haven't read it recently or watched it, I highly recommend that you watch it. It would be well worth your time. But he talks about this particular moment that he says, Jesus uttered that cry from the cross saying, why hast thou forsaken me? And he didn't get an answer. And he explains that Jesus had to feel what it was like to be completely cut off from the presence of God. And this culminates here on the cross in that moment. And then the next thing that we assume he says right before dying is John 19:28, where he said, I thirst. So what did they do? They ran and dipped a hyssop in vinegar mingled with gall, or in one account, the Greek is just a sour wine, and they put it up. He smells it and he rejects it. Just as a side note, hyssop is a sponge-like herb on the tip of a stalk, a wooded stalk basically, that could act like a paintbrush. It's interesting because in the Old Testament, in Exodus, when we have the original Passover, the 10th plague of Egypt, the people were commanded to kill a lamb, get the blood from the lamb, and take hyssop, dip it in the blood of the lamb, and use the hyssop to strike the blood on the corners, or the posts of the door, and on the lintel, the over post of the door. So here you get hyssop coming into the story again. that is also used in Passover meals, where they would dip it into bitter herbs and the Jews would eat it to remind them of the bondage of slavery. And now it's being dipped into bitter gall and vinegar and offered to Jesus. The symbolism is hauntingly beautiful. And then in verse 30, he tells them, or we hear him say, "It is finished." You guys, I don't know how to say this other than to just say it. We often express deep, poignant feelings about the infinite atonement of Jesus Christ by saying things like, "I am so grateful that Jesus died for me." I love that phrase, and I hope you keep saying it. I hope you keep using it. But the reality is the older I get, the more I realize that I stand in more awe and in more amazement, not that Jesus died for me, but that Jesus lived for me. What do I mean by that? I mean that when Jesus goes into Gethsemane and that awful agony starts to descend upon him, every element of his mortal soul would have been screaming at him to die, to give up, to be done. He didn't deserve any of it. But he chose to live. He chose to endure. He's the only person ever born who you can't take his life away from him. You can't kill him. He has to willingly give up the ghost. But he is the only one who also has the capacity to say at any time, "I'm done," and give up that ghost. The fact that Jesus endured Gethsemane, then endured the trials in front of the Sanhedrin, and then endured the trials and the mockery in front of Pilate and Herod and Pilate, and then raised up on the cross in that incredibly difficult setting, and then to have 3 more hours of the weight of Gethsemane return to him, and he chose to live when he didn't have to. He could have died and left us forsaken. So yes, I absolutely marvel that Jesus died for me. But I'm way more grateful that he chose to live for me when everything in his mortal part of his existence was pleading with him to die prematurely. But he didn't, until he could say, "It is finished." Those have become 3 of my favorite words in all Scripture. That phrase right there, "It is finished," means the price is paid. I'm now free to die. He didn't get his dying wish of getting something to drink back there in verse 28. They got the vinegar and gall. Then he says, "Okay, it's finished." He's totally forsaken, totally rejected of men, and left alone by God. But Elder Holland said that in his opinion, the Father was never closer than at that moment, even though Jesus couldn't feel his presence. I like that. And then Luke 23, the statement he closes with is, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." And then he gave up the ghost. Now, to finish this lesson off, because I don't want to leave it there, I want you to go to Matthew 27, verse 50, where he cried with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost. He gave up the ghost. And then verse 51, "And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake and the rocks rent." If we go to the veil of the temple in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, then you're going to see that this thing is 60 feet high, 30 feet wide, a hand's breadth, hand's width thick is what it says. I think it's probably more pleated like this, but anyway, I want you to just see this for a minute. The veil of the temple was rent from top to bottom. You guys, nobody is going to rip that veil. It is too thick. It is it's too powerful. The cloth is strong, 60 feet tall, 30 feet wide, and it ripped from top to bottom. That tells us that man didn't rip the veil. God ripped the veil. There are dozens of explanations for why God ripped the veil. My favorite is the fact that if you look at the temple from above, there are all of these separating points. If you're a Jew, you can come through that sored right there, that dotted line. If you're not a Jew, if you're a Gentile, you can't pass that line or they're going to kill you. If you're a woman, so for the Gentiles, that dotted line that you see on the screen, in the middle of the screen there, with the dot right on it, that's as far as you can come. If you're a woman, you can come into the court of the women right here straight below us. If you're a man, you can go through that Nicanor gate. That's as far as you can get. If you're a priest, you can go into the holy place. If you're the high priest, you can go into the Holy of Holies once a year. Jesus just died. God ripped the veil open so people can now see into the Holy of Holies. He just broke down the barriers. And with the crucifixion of Christ and his resurrection, there are no more foreigners and strangers. It doesn't matter what race you are. It doesn't matter what gender you are. It doesn't matter what your socioeconomic status is. All are alike unto God. He rips that veil open. He wants everyone to come into the presence of God, not just one guy once a year anymore. He wants you to come into his presence. And by Jesus completing a perfect and an infinite and a whole atonement, that veil is now opened. And among all of the other dozens of symbols to represent that veil, I want to just share one more. When a Jewish father or a Hebrew dad finds out about the death of a loved one or of a close family member, the first thing he will instinctively do is reach up and rip his garment as a sign of sorrow. Heavenly Father just completed working through with his son this infinite atonement, Jesus being the one to suffer. It's Jacob in our Book of Mormon who says that the sacrifice of Abraham and Isaac is in similitude of the sacrifice of the only begotten Son and Heavenly Father. If you stop and think about that, Jesus, when he's speaking to Martin Harris through Joseph Smith about his infinite atonement, he tells about all the things that he suffered, and then he said, nevertheless, glory be to the Father. I wonder if he might have been saying something like, which role would you rather have? The role of Abraham or the role of Isaac? And he's saying, don't give me the glory. Give the glory to the Father. So when this event is completed and Jesus has finally finished everything and he can say, I can give up the ghost now, and he does, I wonder if the Father says, I'm going to rip this veil because it's a sign of what the heavens were feeling in that process. In closing, I want you to know that I know that God lives, that he is your Father, that Jesus is the Christ, that his suffering was not metaphorical, it wasn't theoretical, it was real. And one of my favorite statements regarding this whole lesson is, a perfect man at an imperfect trial was found guilty, so that an imperfect man at a perfect trial might be found not guilty. Know that you're loved.